It's our job as Christians to help enact that work of God in the world here. It's not about saving our butts for the afterlife, right? It's about here and now, just as much, if not more so, as it is about anything in the eternities.
I love that because I sometimes feel like we have a little bit of a cultural tendency, like you said, cover our butts. It's pretty intense to have vernacular around, I qualify for the celestial kingdom because I was just married in the temple, for example. And now I've got my ticket to heaven. That might be where some of these pains are coming from because I feel like my butt isn't covered and I'm out in the wind and the cold all by myself, often wondering if eternal blessings will not apply to me. Or on the other side, on the days where I feel more doubt, it's sometimes like, oh gosh, am I going to miss out completely on my one shot to do all of this fun stuff? And will I not get to do all of it? So both sides feel very painful, but sorting through it has led to some of the most beautiful experiences of my life, honestly.
Hello, everybody. You are listening to The Soloists. My name is Diana Brown, and I'm here with my friend Mallory Everton. And today we're picking up a question of why singles are less likely to be religious than married people. To talk about this, we've invited our friend and guest, Jana Reiss, who is a researcher who has spent many years studying Latter-day Saints in the United States. She's the author of the 2019 book, The Next Mormons, How Millennials Are Changing the LDS Church, which drew upon a nationally representative survey of nearly 1,700 current and former Latter-day Saints. So we were looking for stories that exemplify this question of where singleness and religiosity have friction between them, right? Where it can feel like a forced choice where you have to choose between the life presented to you as a single person and the life that your religion primed you for. And so we wanted to share what I think is sort of an unspoken classic in whatever non-literature, non-canon there is of writing on LDS singlehood, which is this New York Times piece from 2011 written by Nicole Hardy called Single Female Mormon Alone. Mallory, do you want to read that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Of all the places I felt sure I'd never go, Planned Parenthood topped the list. Yet one spring afternoon found me in its waiting room. I was a 35-year-old virgin, preparing for my own first time, which incidentally didn't happen until I was well into 36. I was not frigid, fearful, or socially inept, not overweight or unattractive, didn't suffer from halitosis or social anxiety disorder. I was a practicing Mormon, and Mormons wait until marriage. So I had waited, spent the first 2 decades of my adult life celibate, and for the most part, alone. Because only after the trial of my faith would I be blessed with an eternal marriage, which I prayed would also blow my mind in the bedroom. It never occurred to me that I would remain unmarried, especially in a system where marriage is not only a commandment, but also one of life's primary purposes. My only available choice within the church was to wait for my reward in heaven, as Mormon doctrine promises that single members denied marriage, family, and sex lives on earth will have them after death. Needless to say, this wasn't a compelling argument. The few relationships I did have, all with non-Mormon men, lasted only a few weeks, months if it was summertime and all dates could begin and end outside in daylight, delaying the expectations of physical contact that darkness inspires. The pattern was predictable. At first, men were intrigued, turned on by my virginity, the landscape of uncharted territory, my innocence and curiosity. However, every time fantasy met reality, these men went in search of something simpler. And who could blame them? We were grown adults. I tried for 15 years not to lose hope. The gospel was the answer. It had saved my parents, each of whom had converted separately when they were young. Thanks to the Mormon Church, they escaped childhoods rife with abuse, alcoholism, and neglect. Out of chaos, they created a tiny space where our family of 4 lived happily and prospered. My whole life I'd felt secure, fulfilled, purposeful, and connected. And further, I'd made a commitment. Why would I abandon God and his church now, when in all ways but one I had asked and had received? Perhaps the failure was mine. I'm sure many church members see it that way. I was too weak to endure. They'll say I should have waited another decade or spent my whole life alone if that's what God required. I'm just unwilling to continue spiraling further into a disconnected life, feeling abandoned, being discounted. Oddly, my trip to Planned Parenthood provided much that the church had not in recent years. During my exam, the clinician explained every move before she made it, asked permission to touch me during the most routine procedures. I was mystified by the level of attention paid to my body as if it were fragile or scared. How unprepared I was to experience tenderness in the place I had been warned so vehemently against. How unprepared for the flood of relief, the bud of hope, after a life devoted to keeping myself separate from my body. Here was a path, an opening. Here was empathy. I would have an IUD instead of children. I would write poems and finally live inside my body. I would, for the love of God, feel a man's hands on me before I died.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So, what are your immediate reactions hearing this story?
I think that it's beautifully captured. There is a clear tension in having to basically choose parts of yourself, you know? It's not a straightforward the church forced me to into permanent adolescence. It's like I've ended up not being able to develop in this area that all these other adults are developing in, and I also love and see the value of this community that I came out of. It's very honest.
Yeah,
It's painfully honest.
totally. Jana, what do you see in it?
A lot of pain, a lot of anxiety, I think, about
Mm,
her role in the community and also whether she will be accepted outside of the community should she choose to make that leap. I
mhm.
went on to read her memoir called Confessions of a Latter-day Virgin. And so we get more of her story in that. And it's tough, I think, for her and for many women who never thought that they would be in this situation where they were unmarried. That's the life they had been preparing for. I'm not discounting that men have also been primed to prepare for marriage within an LDS context, but it's different.
Yeah, totally. I've read her memoir as well. It's really beautiful and harrowing, and it's interesting that things definitely don't get easier necessarily after she makes this decision. But that sense, when she's describing this, a path, an opening, an empathy.
Mm,
I think as an older single woman in the church, it can be really easy to feel like the only future that was acceptable for you, that you were prepared for, is now increasingly
mhm.
unlikely to happen. And this message that you're supposed to wait till the next life, it's like, what do I do with these decades? And I can totally understand all of us like looking at our lives and being like, really, what kind of future is offered here? One thing that feels like a deeply Mormon concept is her just sitting with herself, her body, her time, her talents, and saying, what really can I do with these? Like, how can I consecrate these the rest of my life? And the typical Mormon life she is offered, which is now just be celibate for the rest of your life and don't pursue these other lifestyle options that are available to you, just feels like not the best use of her time and talents and gifts.
Diana, in some of our preparation materials, you pulled a term from, I don't know if I'm going to say her name right, Danielle Treweek? Treweek? Do you know what I'm talking
Uh,
about? She
yeah, I
describes
do.
faithful single adults as threshold people who feel like they have no life to live here and they're supposed to look forward to the next life. And it feels like our culture, it obviously is not true just for single people. It's also very true and painfully true for LGBTQ people. And there are other people as well who might fall into this category, but I feel like there's a specific pain to feeling like your life is not allowed to be lived until you're
Mhm.
dead.
I just want to point out here, as someone who converted to Mormonism from Protestantism, that this is weird.
Hmm. It's
This
great to hear.
conversation is weird because in the Bible, which we revere as the Word of God, both Paul and Jesus are single, and Paul is explicit that this is a superior way of life
Hmm.
for Christians, right? And so, in that same kind of belief, Paul was encouraging Christians in the first century to remain single because they could dedicate themselves wholly to the love and service of God. I feel like
Hmm.
that's a message that we just don't hear in our church, where singleness is identified as a problem to be solved. This is a point that Nicole Hardy makes in her memoir as well, rather than an opportunity for the kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was thinking about this earlier, how one of the things I really appreciate about Mormonism is the way that transcendence is made so imminent and so tangible and this worldly. I think about growing up and all of the milestones you had that allowed you to call down God in a special age at age 12 when you went into Young Women's and age 14 when you advanced into Maya Maids, and then all of these steps that just usher you beautifully through life and feel suited to that stage of development when you're growing up. They're so good at translating how this work of devotion to God, like how this works with the life and the body that you are given. I totally agree with you. I think, the biblical concept of singleness is really beautiful and compelling. But the kinds of things that our religion does to like show people like this is how you in your body, in your life stage, at your age, wherever you're at, this is how you can consecrate yourself to God. We just don't have those same tools for thinking about singles. And so it feels like a blank canvas. And I guess if we were
Mm.
belonging to a religion that like just doesn't have as much emphasis on those things in the first place, we would probably feel the gap a little bit less. But because our religion does that so well, the absence of it can just make you feel that you're stuck in adolescence. And the secular world is offering some
Mhm.
milestones and markers of adulthood that are available to you. If there's nothing in the church that sees those as like useful things in building the kingdom, you can just feel like, okay, well, there's this one world that offers me no dignity, and then there's this world that does. You
Mm.
can see why people are compelled by that.
Yeah, and I know that in my experience, I very, very aware of the fact that no parties are thrown for me unless I have babies or unless I get married, right? Like
Mhm.
I'm gonna need to throw my own showers
Ouch.
for my career success. But it always felt like it was this consolation prize, that it was worldly, that it was more like I'm pursuing the filthy lucre of money because I can't have the true purpose of a partnership and children. And I think that's also just very present for me with this as well, that it doesn't feel like they're even comparable because one feels like in our culture it's seen as meaningful and the other thing is almost seen as selfish, especially for women, right? Like
Yes,
I've
Mhm.
especially.
chosen my career over children when it's like I never made that active choice. I'm just trying to make the most of the life in front of me, you know?
Well said.
Nothing's more triggering to me than a KitchenAid because it feels like I wanted one for so long, for so many years, and would go to wedding showers of my cousins and friends, and everyone's getting KitchenAids and, there's just like that.
Really?
Totally.
Yeah, the lack of acknowledgement for the things that you accomplish as a single person is hard to hold. Yeah.
Right. It's almost like people are determined to see your life as a tragedy. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's impossible to get away from the fact that our perception is leading to this pressure to make some kind of decision. Like, are you in or out? Because if you go out, you'll have all these other opportunities. And if you stay in, you'll be locked in this box forever. And it's like, I
Yeah.
don't think it's as black and white as that, but our perceptions are really
Uh-huh.
adding to that mounting, increasing
Yeah,
pressure. Like, you have to make some kind of decision or else you're going to regret
I
it
know.
forever. It's like, just got to take some deep breaths.
Mm.
I
It's gonna
mean,
work
yeah.
out. I have to remind myself of that all the time.
It's certainly not as black and white as that, and I hope that we'll have time in this conversation to talk about those quiet spiritual fruits of the gospel are still there and available and necessary. It's
Mhm,
just I think that, though, that, like, everything in between, you can just feel unseen and unsupported. So,
Mm.
yeah, talking more about our threshold people of singles,
mhm.
why they tend to be less religious, which is something that sociological data will consistently show. Do we want to just start by talking a little bit about this process of secularization of essentially like leaving religion or religious practice? Jana, how would you describe secularization?
How long is your podcast? It
Yeah,
is
I know.
it is so hard to pin it down. I think for the purposes of our conversation here, we are focusing on primarily choices about organized religion, choices that people make. Looking at individual behaviors, we're definitely seeing a rise in secular identity among Americans. And this is hitting every religious tradition, not necessarily equally, but everyone is affected by it. The share of the non religious, people who say they have no religious affiliation, has generally increased with every major national study over the last decade and a half.
Hmm. Right. One of the things that I think is important to point out is that this doesn't always mean they don't believe anything or
No.
even that they don't have religious practice. In fact, famously, the religious nuns, NONES, the people who just, when they're presented with a list of options of which of these religions do you identify with, the people who are like, I don't have any of those, none, that a lot of them still believe in God and maybe even go to
Right.
church and pray
Mhm.
and have these religious practices. It's just whether you find your home in the institution of religion is a question, and whether that presents itself as something that you should take into your
Mhm.
identity rather than something that you just engage or think about occasionally. So
That's fascinating. So, a religious nun in that situation, NONE, is not necessarily agnostic or atheist. In fact, they're saying that they don't identify as agnostic or like that doesn't
mm,
resonate with
hmm
them from an identity perspective.
Well,
That's interesting.
some do, but it's a minority.
Okay.
Among the non-religious population, the largest category is nothing in particular. So
Mm.
if you are to parse that none category into atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, and like I think those are the big ones. Anyway, nothing in particular wins. And it's an interesting category because those people are also less engaged with other things. It's not just religion, but less engaged with political behavior, for example, with community volunteering, belonging in other organizations. It's more systemic. It's not just about religion.
Yeah, which is such an interesting point about this conversation too, that institutional engagement tends to be bundled
Mm.
and married life tends to be bundled really tightly with religion. Those two
Well said.
institutions really like each other. It's not necessary that you are married if you're religious or religious if you're married or whatever, but whatever the kind of lifestyles those support, they mutually support each other. So,
Yes, they are definitely mutually reinforcing. And I think in the LDS context, that is even more so
mhm.
because all of our leaders are married in terms of who is
Yeah.
leading the church on the
Yes.
male side, not necessarily in terms of general officers among women. There have been a couple, but can you think of a general authority who's a man who is single, never married, not just widowed, right?
No, not a single
Right.
one.
They don't exist. And so when you have that as your example to follow, because we're told that these men are godly, we're told that they are speaking for God. Marriage is not just the recommended course, it is the modeled course. It is the
Mhm.
only model course for a
Mhm.
godly life.
Yeah.
I think it's also notable that they can't relate to your experience in that, like, they can't lead, teach, guide from an educated place when it comes to single people. So
Right.
the chances that certain policies are going to be formed with a single person in mind are much lower when all of the leadership was married from a young age and have been their whole lives.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to speak as a married person. I've been married for almost 33 years
Oh,
now.
congratulations.
Well, I mean, it's worked out great. I'm glad, but it is hard for people who have been long married, I think, to understand how tough it is for single members of the church. And the example that you just gave is of someone who got married very young, which I think characterizes most of our general authority church leaders. They didn't have to go through their 30s being told, you have to be celibate forever if you don't
Right.
get married in a heterosexual marriage. This will be your life always. And there is a finality to that they've never experienced. And unless they specifically and intentionally aim to put themselves in the shoes of single members and experiencing life as they do, they don't get it.
Yeah, I would say the same thing with LGBTQ members, right? They also have never been told you literally can't date.
Right.
Like, it's okay to be gay, but you can't date. It's like, okay. So there's the idea of not necessarily being able to develop when it comes to physical intimacy with partners, but that's even social intimacy. Like, that it's a very bleak prospect.
The empathy gap is so huge. It's so huge.
Would it be helpful to get deeper into this data now? Into the
Yeah.
specifics of what it might tell us?
Yeah, let's do that. To set up the conversation for Jana, because we wanted to hear about your research with Latter-day Saint singles, I was looking at Pew's Religious Landscape Survey, which was last conducted in 2014, so it's already 10 years out of date. But it shows a very strong relationship between singleness and religiosity. They found that people who have never been married are less formally religious than people who are married or divorced or separated or widowed on every single measure: prayer, meditation, belief in the importance of religion, belief that scripture is a literal word of God, attendance in religious services, etc. The never married singles are the equivalent to married people or just barely surpass them on only two measures of spirituality, which are a sense of spiritual peace and well-being and a sense of wonder at the universe.
Hmm.
Um, I sense that's probably because those are just less institutionally laden terms.
Yeah, seems like
Um,
a language thing, maybe like
yeah.
a kind of backdoor
Uh-huh.
to a religious experience for someone who's no longer comfortable with formalized religion.
Right. And then in terms of how people identify formally, single people are definitely more likely to identify as atheist, agnostic, or a nun, the nuns that we were talking about. So Pew's findings have been corroborated by the sociologist Ryan Burge. He published a report on the changes in marital status and religiosity between 2008 and 2022, where he found that 50% of single men and women identified either as atheists, agnostics, or religious nuns, and that was compared to about 30% of married people who identify that way. So basically, that's
Wow.
just, yeah, that's a huge gap.
Mhm.
He had some really interesting data about why singleness is related to secularization for men and women, because they have different stories for why both of them are more likely to secularize or to not be as religiously practicing. But before we get into that, Jana, do you want to talk about what that looks like in the LDS context? How much is
Sure.
our community mapping onto these general trends? Because all of this is referring to general American adults that we've
Mhm.
talked about so far.
So Latter-day Saints are more likely to be buried than other Americans are, whether that's their first marriage or that's a remarriage after a divorce or separation or bereavement. So it's a married culture, um, but definitely even Latter-day Saints are changing. For Latter-day Saints, my research partner, Benjamin Knoll, and I did this survey in 2016, and that resulted in the book, The Next Mormons, which, as you said, focused on millennials. Our research, we did another survey in 2022 and 2023, and the focus of the book that's coming out of that research is on people who've left the church or who have stayed LDS and are still identifying as LDS, but for whatever reason are not quite as active or orthodox or stalwart as some of the most loyal members are. And we do find that singles, people who've never married, are more likely to be in either of those two groups, the former Mormons or the what we're calling the liminals, the people who are in the middle, than married people are. So
Mhm.
if you are married, particularly if you're married to your first spouse in the Latter-day Saint community, that correlates in lockstep with certain things, including religious orthodoxy, some kinds of religious behavior. Singles are less likely, for example, to read the scriptures every day. They're less likely to say that they attend on a weekly basis, that they attend church. They're less likely to read the scriptures every day. But as you said, in the Pew data, they also have these measures in which they are spiritually coming out roughly the same as married members. We saw that in our data as well, that it's pretty similar on those measures of experiencing wonder in the universe, a sense of wonder, feeling closeness to God. Those were not marked by the difference that we're seeing in the more formal, organized religion kinds of behaviors.
That's really interesting.
I would like to go back to something that Diana was saying about gender and
Mm.
think about how that plays out in a Latter-day Saint community. In 2016, educationally, we noticed that a college education was a beneficial component of orthodoxy for every group except for one. So having a college education was more likely to correlate with people attending church on a weekly basis, with having very strong beliefs in Joseph Smith as a prophet, all of those things, which is maybe different than the stereotype that, oh, if you're going to go to college, you lose your faith. Actually, the
Mhm.
data doesn't bear that out. But for women who have advanced degrees and we're still hanging on in the church, who are still members of the church, that was not the case. They were not as orthodox. And very interesting and telling that finding has been seen in other national surveys of religion in general, that women who have a certain educational level and who have a certain income level and that sense of sort of success in the world, well, they're looking around and saying, what is religion offering me? And maybe the answer is a beautiful thing. Maybe it's not.
Wow. So
Yeah.
interesting. Um, yeah, so Ryan Burge was very curious about this divergence of paths towards secularization for single men and single women. He did a whole list of variables and tried to see which ones were statistically associated with that. For men, singleness is likely to be the most predictive variable around whether or not they remain religious. For women, it's like a part of the picture of why they're leaving, but it's not the full story. So, to quote him directly, singleness is not a gateway to the secular life for women, but it seems strongly predictive for men. What he was getting at is basically like if men just get married, they're going to go to church with the wife and the kids. So it almost feels like there's this up close and personal need for men. Like they just need somebody to grab their hand and take them or something like that. But that's what he was getting at is like singleness itself is the reason, right? Like, and if they were married, they would presumably be more religious. For women, it was this question of meaning. So he was saying women are more concerned about their unequal treatment of women in American society and are more suspicious of institutions that uphold traditional social arrangements. So for women, they're looking at this institutional bundle and like, I don't want this anymore. It doesn't map onto my values. Women seem more perhaps looking for ideological alignment here. It's the meaning question and the clash of values that is driving women to be more secular, single women in particular.
It reminds me of a part of Nicole's essay where she goes in to share this anecdote about having a conversation with a Mormon guy who was saying, well, Mormon men are providers and you don't need to be provided for. And she was like, well, what about a strong spiritual connection? What about building lives together? And I don't know, it seems to match up a little bit with the idea that the system does benefit our sort of previous idea of what marriage is. If it's like, men are more dependent on women for social or emotional needs, and women are more dependent on men for economic needs. And that's no longer true. And so our system has been built on an idea of marriage that is changing so much that it doesn't work for women in the same way. It is complicated. If something about being in a partnership helps a man feel more like a man and fit into a religious community and understand his relationship with God, and it hurts a woman's ability to feel like herself and to show up in strength and light as who she feels she really is.
Mm.
We have a lot of work to do, you
Oh,
know?
Yeah.
that is so well said. So well said. So while you were talking, I was thinking about this question that we asked in 2016 and again in the most recent data, which is a binary question where you get to choose between two options of what you think a more ideal marriage would look like. One is where the husband provides for the family and the wife takes care of the house and the children. And the other is one where the husband and wife both have jobs and both take care of the house and children. In 2016, basically, we saw a 60-40 split. That has shifted to an exact 50-50 split among current Latter-day Saints. And it's interesting when you look at that question by gender, because for only the most Orthodox members are women now above men on that question of preferring the traditional marriage. It
Mm.
used to be that women were the stalwart defenders of that. And now for former Latter-day Saints, but also for the bigger group that is the liminal Latter-day Saints, it's men who tend to want that marriage. I wonder why, more so than
Mhm.
women.
Well, yeah, that's so interesting. And tying the loop back to this conversation about like why single men and single women have these different paths towards secularization. One of the things that just haunts me about this is it's like, okay, if I were in charge of everything and I was trying to think through like how do you help singles feel more at home in religion? It feels like the solution for men is get married and the solution for women is liberalize. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but like make more abundant the opportunities to see and value women's diverse capacities and roles and opportunities, and don't pigeonhole them into this super traditional thing. And you can see how those might
Yeah.
not work together, and this is not at all an issue that is contained to our church or to religion in general. This is something that now people are starting to talk about in general, that men and women's political interests and lifestyle interests are not syncing up. And so they're worried about a big demographic disaster if people can't figure out how to get married because the men were wanting something more traditional than the girls do.
It is quite
Interesting.
haunting. It's haunting to still be in the dating market knowing that that's bubbling under the surface. It always feels like it's coming down to the way that we're defining the masculine and the feminine in the world and in ourselves and in each other. And I think we're really struggling to understand what a man is. I listened to this podcast a couple weeks ago where they were talking about toxic masculinity, and the person being interviewed was saying that he's starting to hear that as a slur because he was like, so many traits are being described as toxic for men that they have nowhere to go with that it feels like it's basically just something that's labeled on being a man. And so it really does start to feel like we're getting further and further from each other, in part because coming out of patriarchal backgrounds, we don't know what a divine man should look like sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm grateful for Jesus for that. But yeah, it just seems like we're struggling with men in that way.
The whole culture.
So we wanted to play a game called Dump Him or Date Him. Diana and I are both dating non-members at this point in our lives, and it's a very complicated thing. But Jana is in an interfaith marriage, and so we thought it would be fun to talk through some of the things we've been approaching because we see her as a brilliant and wise resource in this area. So Jana, would you be up for that?
I'm certainly up for it. I can't vouch for having perfect advice. We were criticizing church leaders moments ago for that inability to leave their own experience. But that's also a very human trait. And you may see me doing that because I've had such a positive experience in an interfaith marriage that I'm going to assume that it's right for everybody, right?
Yeah, we want to hear about that. And we're open to dating in the church too. I think
Yeah,
we're just trying to be like,
we
how
still
do
like
you-
Mormons.
how do you figure this out? And
Yeah.
I continually just feel like I keep running into situations. I'm like, no one prepared me for this. So the way this is going to work, we're just going to read these one-line descriptions of men we have encountered in the wild.
Well, do I get to ask follow-up questions about these guys, or am I just getting that one little snippet to make a
Sure.
judgment? Okay, well, we'll see.
Yeah, that's the challenge, is to see if you can make a dump him or date him statement.
All right, I will do my best.
Yeah.
I've got one for you, Jenna. He's
Okay.
extremely respectful of your choices and your religion and your faith, and you love each other. But alcohol or drugs are a big deal in his life that you won't be a part of. Like, he works at a brewery, or he likes to do edibles or microdose like every weekend. Like, responsibly, but socially very active in the drug or alcohol community.
I would say that if you are a Latter-day Saint and you are interested in pursuing a Latter-day Saint lifestyle, that would be a hard thing. I'm not
Right.
saying it's necessarily a deal breaker, but that it would be a very difficult divide in a potential relationship or marriage if the differences were that acute. I mean, we're not talking about someone who is an occasional social drinker or someone who is experimenting slightly. It sounds like this is a much bigger part of his life. So I would have to say dump him. But
Yeah. If it's like a
again,
lifestyle. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think that would be the source of a lot of conflict, potentially,
Mm.
especially if you ever had kids, frankly. So that's my conservatism coming out. Hit me with the next one.
Love
Okay,
it.
well, I've got one that's a good follow-up with that. So he doesn't drink. He's not into drugs. He respects your sexual boundaries and your religion, but he's Muslim and the kids have to be raised Muslim. They can't be 10% LDS, 10% anything else. They have to be straightforwardly, no ambiguity, Muslim.
I love this guy. I don't know. I think that could be potentially very interesting. I don't like the all or nothing aspect of it. I think that the most successful interfaith marriages are ones where there is give and take. But from a sociological perspective, he has a point. You know, people who grow up with parents of one religion do tend to not only follow that religion more closely than people who grow up with parents with different religions, but also be more religious just in general than parents who grow up or children who grow up with different religions. So sociologically, that is a fair point. I mean, it comes down, though, how strongly do you want children to be raised LDS? That's a significant source of potential grieving for Latter-day Saint parents. All those different milestones, all of those dreams of seeing your child married in the temple, for example, that's a serious decision. You guys are not giving me any easy questions so far. Yeah.
They are all hard.
They are hard.
With that one, if somebody told me you can either have Muslim kids or no kids at all, I would obviously choose to have kids that were Muslim. But like, you never know if that's the only choice you have. And so it's hard.
Right. Here's another one that has to do with spirituality, and I think is quite common. So he's wonderful, again, respects you and your choices, but he has no spirituality whatsoever. Like, just believes in what he can see and measure, and finds the idea of no life after death actually really beautiful, because it means that this is all we've got and we've got to make the most of it. What do you think about having no spirituality in common, like no spiritual?
When you say he is respectful, so that means that he is not deriding your religious beliefs or in any way expressing contempt for your beliefs.
No, just
Then-
not something you can share.
Not something you can share. I think that one does have some potential. If you are both very open with each other right from the start about how you feel about it, and that mutual respect, the respect has to go both ways. He would be respectful of the fact that you do have religion, and you would be respectful of the fact that he does not see the need for it and consider it a learning opportunity. Obviously, there are big issues there in terms of family and raising children and dealing with in-laws and all of those things. But that one, if respect is the foundation, I think give it a chance.
Can I ask a follow-up on this one?
Yeah.
He respects your approach to your faith, but not your more orthodox family's approach.
Interesting.
Like maybe finds your family a little ridiculous, has a hard time understanding them.
That might be hard, because in a marriage, it's not just marrying the person, it's also marrying that person's family. And so it's a factor to consider. Definitely.
I love that the theme here is, while this is a very complex territory, with a respectful foundation, a lot more is possible.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality of any marriage, right, is that over the course of years and decades, both of you will change tremendously. So the person that you marry is not going to be necessarily the same person 3 decades from now, or however long it is. And so there is a sense of curiosity, and openness is of value. It's a good thing. Here's a totally trivial example, okay? When we were 46, my completely nerdy husband, neither one of us had ever been athletic at all, always last picked for teams. That was us, essentially. He started training for a marathon, like out of the blue. And he started running marathons, and he's training for a marathon right now. I mean, I think it's great. It's like crazy, but I would never have seen that coming. My mother, when she was in her 50s, after decades of not being religious at all, became a Lutheran. And for the last decade or so of her life, almost 2 decades, she was very religious. Wouldn't have seen that coming. And people change on us all the time in ways that are both trivial and profound. And so I think the best relationships are predicated on a sense of them having the freedom to do that, and you having that freedom as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what this whole conversation is about, right? The idea that as the landscape changes and as your mental frameworks and your spirituality changes, that you may go in and out of the way that you approach life and the way you approach faith communities and belief and dating. I mean, all of this seems like permission to change and grace for all.
Grace for all. In all of these oral history interviews, more than 100 that I've done with people over the last few years. But some of the most heartbreaking stories are of people who married a role rather than married a human. And when you do that, which frankly, I would say that is something that the church has in the past at least encouraged people to do. Marry the priesthood holder, marry the guy who can take you to the temple, or marry the trophy wife who is your reward after you served a successful mission, whatever it is. That's all very role-based rather than person-based. And when you marry the role, what happens when that person no longer wants to inhabit that role? The priesthood holder decides to leave the church, or this very orthodox, beautiful woman becomes unorthodox and decides to no longer take care of her beauty in the way that he thinks she should. If you marry the role and not the person, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Oh,
Totally.
that's so well said. And speaking to those stereotypes that have haunted me my whole life.
Oh, I'm so sorry. There are some real blessings about not having grown up Mormon. So I'm sometimes
Sure.
very glad of that.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time trying to pull out all the weeds around me needing to be some kind of prize for a well-behaved
Oh,
man.
ouch. Yeah.
I know.
One time we had the missionaries over for dinner, and one of them made a comment, once I get home, God's going to provide this beautiful woman for me. And, up here in my office, I have a trophy that I won when I was like 16 or 17 in high school. And I wanted to just get up out of my seat and go get that for him and hand it to him and say, if it's a trophy you want, just take this. But this is a terrible thing to do to your future spouse, to treat her as though she's anything less than a fully divine daughter of God. She does not exist to be an object in your story. She is actually the subject of her own.
Okay. Not to make this serious all of a sudden, but I am trying to think about the guy's perspective here, where they're tied to religion does feel more like up close, tangible, like I want a wife to take me, or I need to be needed. Obviously,
Wanting
these
to
are
feel
major
of
generalizations,
use.
but that capacity for family and frankly, the religion offering access to sex and a way to be a male body in a religious space, I can see how there's a way in which that works. I don't think it's bad to have roles and to have general structures and guidelines that sort of help people have shortcuts for ways to relate to each other in general frames, but there has to be give, and you have to be emotionally intelligent enough to see through them as well. It does feel like the guys who do well in marriage, for example, especially in this day and age when people can divorce, I assume that they figure out how to treat their wives like real people. And if you don't know how to do that, if you don't know how to see the person and the role or the person beside the role, I imagine you'll have a hard time partnering these days. So
I remember listening to, I think it was Barbara Gardner, talk about how God can't just teach us with calculus right away. Like we have to learn arithmetic first. And so sometimes it almost feels like, well, this isn't the truth. This is like this fake thing that I have to, or this not whole thing that I have to sort out for something better and something truer all the time. But maybe we start with feeling like God loves me and will bless me. And in my young 19-year-old brain, that means a hot girl. And can you blame a man for loving beautiful women, And how that will mature and grow. Because I know I've been there many times thinking that I would get certain rewards for basically our personalized version of prosperity gospel that becomes more mature as we get older,
being single, it feels like you're constantly in this liminal transition state. You're like your life hasn't begun yet, and you're not sure what's going to happen in a few years. Our futures, if we're at least planning to get married, can feel a little bit unsettled. That's not to say that married people don't have open futures as well, and curveballs, of course they do. But there's at least 2 or 3 major things that can feel pretty settled. And, singles being in this liminal space, living in between worlds a little bit. What do you think are the gifts of liminality? And by extension, the gifts that singles who relate to feeling that way can bring to the church?
Liminality is a place of great potential and the potential for transformation and change. In our research, I said that we divided our sample into 3 groups. We have people who've left the church. On the one side, we have people who are very orthodox and stalwart and hold a temple recommend and pay full tithe on the other side. And in the middle is this group that we're calling liminals. I really feel strongly that this is a group that needs more attention in the church and also by scholars. It's not a group that's been studied very much at all. And it's hugely important right now, I think, especially because we have a lot of, I would say, anger on both of those extremes, anger from people who have left the church, and then a lot of anger from people who are stalwart, who don't understand why people are leaving the church. Liminals have the potential, sitting in the middle, to be a balm in those conversations because they do have one foot on either side and they can understand that experience. Back to singles, I think that gift of liminality, of being able to understand different experiences, what singles can bring to the church is this sense of, hey, I have gifts that are not going to be necessarily encapsulated in this path that you have laid out for me. What else about that path do we need to reevaluate? Right?
The gift of being willing to ask the questions and challenge the community by presenting diversity, by presenting something that doesn't quite fit.
Right.
Totally. And the word translation comes to mind, which is a word in our tradition that like has such a strong, powerful religious valence. The restoration as involving this text translated from a forgotten people that is now rendered comprehensible to us in modern times, or this broader idea of translation, of moving from one state to another. Liminality constantly requires you to be moving between worlds and able to talk to both of them. Like this idea of institutional bundling and the way that family and religious life are so tightly bundled together. Liminal people, and by extension in this conversation, singles, could be really helpful in thinking across institutional boundaries, right? All of the thinking that needs to be done for those that don't fit tightly and cleanly into this life. Like, how do we translate the gospel into their framework?
That's right. And it's both ways as well. How do you translate the gospel for a world that may be apathetic or not understand it or even be openly hostile, although I think that's a lot rarer than the LDS persecution narrative tends to suggest. But also, how does it look on the other side? Because one of the things that you were saying earlier in our conversation was that as women, you are experiencing a lot of joy and accolades and success in this world that sometimes is decried from the pulpit, right? So translating it back to explain to people who are in the church and for whom that script has worked out very well and they assume it's going to work out for everyone and it's only their fault if it doesn't work out, you can tell them, actually, there are a lot of attractive things about that world that I'm not getting here. How do we address that?
Yeah, there's almost like a merging of the worlds in some way. I'm thinking about something Diana said when I first met her. She was talking about the potential of finding children to pour her life into that are not literal children. If children are this stand-in for purpose, love, care, nurturing, there are so many opportunities for that. And it feels almost like redemptive work to be able to say, like, could even the metaphors set up in our community help us to find meaning outside of it or outside of the frameworks that we usually use? Because I think there is a potential for those things to shine beautiful lights on each other.
And on that note, there needs to be real grappling with what it looks like to build relationships in today's world. Like for those of us who our hearts were shaped to want family and kids, that worked. That part of it really worked. And we actually are really trying to figure out how to do that. But as our little game displays, the actual context in which we're trying to figure these things out looks like nothing I was ever set up for. It just feels sometimes like the conversations are so in the clouds and just assuming that everyone's living this fairy tale life. Like, can we just get a little more grounded about what people are actually grappling with?
Right.
And when it comes to like sex and the body, I don't know what the church should do here, but like, can we have real conversations about what it looks like trying to navigate sexual boundaries today? It's easy to go to church and to hear detailed conversations about how to resolve an argument with a spouse or how to help your kids get along. But who's going to teach you how to have the conversations with somebody who has a totally different religious or spiritual background than you about the things that matter to you? Where's the guidance on how to talk about what kind of sexual relationship you want to have? He has his way of engaging with it too. And so if I'm going to build a relationship with him, we have to figure out how to bring both of our worlds together. Yeah, it just feels like there's all of these actual real life things where I'm trying to translate what I was taught into a totally new context. And to the extent
Mm.
that like things look different than I expected, to not have that be like, oh, slippery slope,
Mm-hmm.
etc.
Mm-hmm.
But just wow, good on her for trying to like creatively, earnestly take the gospel into a context that, pioneering it in a new way. I just feel like nobody really prepared me for trying to figure out how to
Nobody did. I
family
mean,
with
I
this.
I don't think there was a young women's lesson on here's what to do if he wants children to be raised Muslim.
Exactly.
I l- I love this call for groundedness though. Diana, I think
Yeah.
it's so good. We talk about it a lot as like single people can't hide. They're complex, complicated situations. And so it's like hopefully a gateway to being able to accept the complexities more than just singleness. And I just think that sometimes we are just like Diana was saying, a little bit too in the clouds. Like we're talking about concepts that actually are not that relatable. And I wish that we had a little bit more reality in the room because reality is so beautiful in the lens of the gospel because there is so much beauty and grace for all of us, despite the fact that we're having to make complex decisions.
Mm.
The terms that come to my mind right away are a la carte Mormonism and the slippery slope. These are two
Mhm.
things that we talk about a lot. The idea that, like, once you start going down that path, you're going to continue to slide down the hill. But that hasn't been my experience, actually. While I understand why people are fearful of it, I think they're fearful of it because of the idea of this transition that is going to complete with you completely turning your back on the community. But it's often what it looks like when someone is maturing and starting to ask really real questions and figure out their real relationship with God versus the one that was given to them.
Yeah.
I think that if we're able to actually respect each other, a lot can go down and as far as
Yes.
people changing and growing and we can still be there for each other. But for some
Yeah.
reason we just really take a lot of comfort in the homogeny. There's
Yeah.
something about making the same choices in the faith community that helps validate your own beliefs. And I do think
Oh,
it's
that's so true.
you know?
Yeah.
Yes, that's so true. It's come home to me actually in working with data and presenting data that people really want to be validated by data, which is not the job of data to make us feel good about our own beliefs or whether we're in the majority in some way. In sociology, there is something called homophily, which is essentially the concept that we love people who are like ourselves. We are most comfortable with people who are like ourselves. And so then the temptation, especially when you add layer of religion onto it, is to make the world over in our own image.
Mm.
Fascinating. I mean, yeah, there's a homophily concept. There's also a concept that Mallory and I, as starting this podcast, are sensitive to, which is that marriage and family is hard and it's
Mhm.
fragile. And there's a lot of people in there being like, did I make the right choice? Is it worth the sacrifice? Is it worth all of this? And there's the potential to look at what we're doing here and being like, dignify us. They might even be perceived as a threat to that too. With, we don't want anyone to feel that way. You can understand wanting people to be like you is because your lifestyle is difficult, right? And you just want people there to support it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think where liminality becomes a less helpful metaphor for singleness is that liminality has the secondary definition of moving from one state to another. And I think that singles, when they're able to surrender that sense of that the church is always saying your life doesn't really begin until you get married, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that they're happier and healthier for it. Just being
Yeah.
able to say, I am complete in myself. If that happens, then that'll be great. If it doesn't happen, this will be great. It will just be different great.
I appreciate your point that what we eventually want to move to is a place where, like, yes, maybe that is part of the shape of your life is a kind of fluidness, but how do you just let it be as it is, like a whole, dignified, valid state in itself? Does singleness have to be a liminal state? It's
Mhm.
certainly not for consecrated singles and other traditions. That's like a very serious, deliberate thing they take on. And there is a transitoriness to the structure of their lives, right? Like they might be called to go do a post in Oklahoma and then go do this elsewhere, but the vow and the commitment and the consecration is settled and stable, and there's nothing liminal about that. It's just like an internal rather than an external anchor. It's something inside that's grounding you instead of the particular house and the particular spouse, etc.
Mm. Can I ask a sort of practical question? Getting back to Nicole Hardy's writing, if we're going to define someone as a threshold person based on basically they're feeling like they're trapped and that they are sort of living for their next life, like looking forward to the next life, what would you say to someone in that position?
Theologically, we are not just a religion for the next life. We never have been. The restored gospel is very much all about how do we transform the world that we're living in right here and right now, and how do we transform ourselves, and how do we help each other? This whole idea, I think we've inherited some from evangelical Christianity in particular, the idea that everything depends on what happens in heaven. That is not the kingdom, right? There's a great book actually by N.T. Wright about this, about how the kingdom that Jesus preached is the kingdom within us, the kingdom that's here right now. And it's our job as Christians and disciples of Christ to help enact that work of God in the world here. It's not about saving our butts for the afterlife, right? It's not about just us with our little nuclear family, always and forever, always together. It's about here and now, just as much, if not more so, as it is about anything in the eternities. We are building something key for God here, and we need all hands on deck.
I love that because I sometimes feel like we have a cultural tendency, like you said, cover our butts. It's pretty intense to have vernacular around, I qualify for the celestial kingdom because I was just married in the temple, for example. And now I've got my ticket to heaven. But that really feels like it's oversimplifying what is a very complex and beautiful tapestry that's being created in the body of Christ and as a planet, frankly,
Yeah, it does.
that it's not just about covering your butt or other people covering their butts, because it's very clear that if that's the point of life, that most people don't end up doing it. And so how are we
That's
going to
right.
make sense of life,
I think we should invent the term cover your butt theology, like CYBT.
I actually really love that because it's something I've thought about quite a bit. It's obviously caused me some pain because I feel like my butt isn't covered and I'm out in the wind in the cold all by myself, often wondering if eternal blessings will not apply to me. Or on the other side, on the days where I feel more doubt, it's sometimes like, oh gosh, am I going to miss out completely on my one shot to do all of this fun stuff? So both sides feel very painful,
I am so sorry.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But sorting through it has led to some of the most beautiful experiences of my life, honestly. And it forces you into an intentionality and usually into some kind of paradoxical beauty that, I don't know, I definitely wouldn't trade. But it doesn't feel like it should be about covering your butt.
That's so true. When we got to the Tree of Life imagery in the Book of Mormon curriculum, somebody made this comment about, how do you open your arms to the world when you're just holding to the rod? You can't.
Yeah.
You can't do both of those things. So this image that we have all clung to, which is one of clinging, may not be the best image of a faith for the whole world, right? Oh, you asked earlier, we were talking about what are the particular gifts of singleness. And Mallory, what you were just talking about is coming to a level of spiritual maturity when the script you were handed didn't work out in some way. And I think for most people, eventually, in some way, they're going to encounter that. Maybe they have a child with disabilities when they're older, or maybe they are married and they're doing all the right things and they're infertile and they can't have children at all. There are all sorts of things. Maybe they get diagnosed with colon cancer at 36. There are all sorts of things that can happen in this completely capricious and unpredictable life that we are inhabiting right now. And people who are spiritually mature come to terms with that and understand, hey, this is not about me primarily. This is about the fact that we live in this world and our job is to become spiritually mature and to become like God. I think many singles in the church, because you've been told your life is supposed to look a certain way, And when it doesn't, despite all of your prayer and effort and putting yourself out there and doing lots of things that married people never even have to think about doing because they met their person at age 17 or whatever ridiculous thing, you just have to come to terms with it perhaps earlier than some other people do.
Absolutely. The fairy tale breaks down so much sooner in life.
Exactly.
Because it breaks down for everybody eventually, right? And like that is spiritual maturity, is realizing like, oh, I'm not living out some fairy tale thing.
You just encapsulated what I rambled on for like 5 minutes about in one sentence. Perfect.
No,
It was beautiful.
all good.
And I appreciate it.
This has been such a beautiful conversation. Janet, just thank you so much for obviously your intelligence and brilliance, but your empathy too, and your way of engaging this conversation.
I'm super grateful for every year of your life that has made you this way. So thank you so much.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. What a lovely thing to say.
Thank you everyone for listening. If you want to continue the conversation with us, we've got a couple of options for you. You're welcome to email us with any feedback or topic suggestions at hello@thesoloists.org. You can also follow us on Instagram. Our account handle is the.soloists. And if you're not on Instagram, don't let us give you FOMO. Enjoy being unplugged from social media. Thanks everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.